When I first laid my eyes on set 11, I immediately took notice of the Inkshadow trait. It reminded me of Zaun in set 9, and I absolutely love that trait and its many crazy interactions. From the infamous Chemtank Jarvan to Zaun magically removing the enemy corner, my hopes were high to find similar strategies. Can Inkshadows match the insanity that was Zaun? Let's find out together. Like always, we have to start with the basics. The trait itself is quite easy to understand. Activating the trait currently grants all of your Inkshadow units 5% bonus damage and damage reduction. You also receive a trait-specific item. Fielding 5 Inkshadows adds another 5% bonus damage and damage reduction, and you receive a second item. Finally, if you manage to find all Inkshadow units and an elusive Inkshadow emblem, you can field 7 Inkshadows, which grants you 2 additional items. So what exactly are these special items? In total, there are 3 offensive and 3 defensive Inkshadow items. For offensive, you have Tattoo of Fury, Bombardment, and Toxin. For defense, you have Tattoo of Force, Protection, and Vitality. These items are not exclusive to Inkshadow units. You can place them on anyone. You can also freely swap these items around by either benching your units or just remove the trait from your board. Mordog mentioned in his set 11 rundown that the item distribution works like this. If you have an offensive item first, then you get a defensive item second, and at the end you get one of each. If you have a defensive item first, then you get an offensive item second, and again, one of each if you max out the trait. But only these categories remain consistent. Each game, the items that appear are randomly selected for each individual player. For example, you could have a game where you start with a Tattoo of Force, but your opponents don't even have it as an option. The easiest way to figure out your item choices is to open up the team planner at the start of the game, add a random Inkshadow unit like Jax, and hover over the trait. This is the core part of Inkshadows. Now let's talk about all of the individual items and what you can do with them. Let's kick things off with the Tattoo of Force. This is arguably one of the most popular defensive choices, partly because it has a great visual effect as well. Putting the item on any unit grants 30 armor and 30 MR. Whenever the holder acquires a new target, the unit will run quickly to and briefly stun them, dealing magic damage when they arrive, and double the defensive stats for a few seconds. Effectively, you can put this item on anyone in your frontline, but there are some units that use it exceptionally well. Inkshadow itself isn't the most popular trait at the moment, but one reroll comp that can compete with the current meta is based around Gnar and Senna. If you combine them with Rek'Sai, Jax, Caitlyn, and Aatrox, you activate all of your traits and roll for your tier 2 units with level 6. The most common setup here is to run a Gnar with a Bloodthirster and Titan's Resolve and give him Tattoo of Force in the early mid game. Gnar gets great value out of this item because he will constantly take out his target and then dash towards someone else, keeping his downtime to a minimum. This will also allow you to itemize Senna earlier, since you don't have to worry about the third Gnar item until later into the game. Another way to use Tattoo of Force is by running 4 Duelist and 3 Inkshadow in stage 3 and giving the item to Volibear. This is usually done as a mid-game power spike to help Volibear get through stage 3, since you do prefer to roll for your Duelists with level 7 starting in stage 4. Unless you have an emblem or an early Lee Sin, you can't reach 6 Duelist early anyways, so it is a valid alternative compared to Sage if you see this as your first item option. In late game comps, especially based around Trickshot and Kai'Sa, you will often see this item placed on Udyr. This is because you likely itemize your main tank already, so he effectively wins by default, as he is the best tank option that you have left. This is not a bad thing, he gets great use out of this item, and it can often be worth activating the trait just to get this tattoo. Since this somewhat fits into everything that I just talked about, let's quickly cover Tattoo of Protection as well. It grants a 50% max health shield to the holder after casting the first time in each combat. After the shield breaks, it grants 50% of this shield amount to the 2 nearest allies. The effect is fairly simple, and there's not much to say about this item, except that it is surprisingly strong, especially for the aforementioned Senna Gnar reroll comp. Aatrox is by far the most popular choice for this item, as he acts as your main tank and he should have a decent amount of HP as a 3-star bruiser. Other units like Rek'Sai, Galio or Udyr are all valid choices as well. It is a great item even in the early game, and you should not disregard this as an option, because if we strictly go by stats, it appears to be the best performing tattoo at the moment. The final defensive item is called Tattoo of Vitality, and it is widely regarded as the worst tattoo in the game. If players spot this as their first option, it pretty much signals them to not run Inkshadows at all and go for something more useful instead. So why is this item considered so weak? The description states that attacks heal the holder for 2.5 of their max health and deal the same amount as bonus damage. One of the first problems that you will immediately encounter is that frontline units tend to have the worst base attack speed in the game. For example, you would assume this is a great item for Kobuko due to his HP scaling, but he only has a 0.5 base attack speed. It also doesn't help that he has an insanely long dance animation. Obviously, you don't want to give attack speed items to your frontliners, and they often tend to be hit by crowd control, making this item extremely inefficient. This means it's often better to give it to a backliner, but now you have low damage and low sustain. However, not all hope is lost. I got a great tip from a YouTube comment that suggested giving this item to Aurelia. Now, why would you do this? Aurelia attacks in a very unique way. She has 7 blades that she is weaving through her opponents. Normally, if you give her an item like Hurricane or Ginzo, then the item would trigger every time a new unit was hit by the first blade. But obviously, you don't receive 7 Ginzo stacks or 7 Hurricane bolts for every unit. With Tattoo of Vitality, this works a bit differently. For some reason, very likely an oversight by Riot, every individual blade can proc the bonus magic damage. So in theory, if you give her 2 Vamox, she ends up with 3852 HP and deals around 96 magic damage with each of her 7 blades that goes through a unit. This can definitely result in some pretty noteworthy magic damage and also some very strong healing. Who knows, maybe putting Aurelia with a Vamox and Tattoo of Vitality might make her into a formidable tank. This strategy definitely has a lot of potential, but since this qualifies as non-Riot approved fun, I would suggest to hurry up because this will likely be fixed in the future. This covers all of the defensive items, but what about the offensive ones? Let's start off with the Tattoo of Bombardment. This item grants 20% attack damage and attack speed. Every third attack fires bolts at the 2 lowest percent health enemies, with each bolt dealing physical damage based on 60% of the holder's attack damage. In short, you want this item on a unit with high attack damage, but also on a unit with high attack speed to proc the effect more often. The ideal unit for this tends to be Senna 3-star, since she wants a Ginzo's Rage Blade, has high base AD, and gives herself an AD steroid with every cast. You can also give it to Kai'Sa, since she usually runs around with strong AD items, like Infinity Edge or Death Blade, but here the item is usually just a placeholder until you find something stronger. Now you might wonder, how exactly does this item interact with Kai'Sa while she's channeling? The answer here is surprisingly simple. She fires a total of 20 waves, and 5 waves are treated the same as 1 attack. This means she receives 4 Ginzo stacks or fires 4 Hurricane bolts during 1 cast. Since the Tattoo of Bombardment only procs every 3 attacks, this means she has 1 guaranteed proc during her cast and needs less attacks afterwards for the next proc. In case you're curious, Asher cast counts as 3 attacks, and Aurelia would end up needing to hit 3 units in total for 1 proc. One great user for this item that I haven't mentioned yet is Bard. Since his item build is completely based on attack speed, and usually you want him as a 3-star, he tends to have the correct stats to get the most out of this item. With the help of Trickshot, it's not uncommon for the additional bolts to help take down the enemy backline. Considering the tattoo even has Bard in its name, it only makes perfect sense that it works well on him. Then we also have the Tattoo of Fury, which only grants 25% attack speed, but it has a very powerful effect. The holder deals 35% bonus damage to targets below half health and gains 40% attack speed for 6 seconds after a takedown. This is an item you can pretty much give to any of your carries. One thing that is important to keep in mind is that this effect is not based on the HP that the holder is currently attacking. Any AoE or board-wide ability will benefit from the damage increase if a unit is below 50% HP. While units like Senna, Volibear or Kai'Sa are all decent users, it can also be very good on AP carries, since 35% bonus damage with a fairly easy condition is nothing to sneeze at. Quite frankly, it is also powerful enough that you can consider keeping it on your main carry until the very end. For this item, I don't really have a list of good users, since the effect is so beneficial for all units that you can just put it on any of your carries and call it a day. The final item is called the Tattoo of Toxin. Based on stats, it is currently the strongest offensive Inkshadow item in the game. The holder receives 25% AD and AP, and the damage applies a toxin that deals an additional 33% of dead damage over 3 seconds, while also reducing incoming healing. This item is honestly just a Morelos in disguise, except that the damage over time tends to be either physical or magic, depending on the ability. The true power definitely lies in the anti-heal effect, so units like Morgana, Hui or Aurelia are among the best users. It also doesn't hurt that some early game units like Teemo love it as well, so you should never have too many issues finding a holder. If we go back to the original question, then how does this trait compare to Zaun? It's definitely more convenient knowing your items in advance and being able to place them on any unit, but as a consequence, it does feel like the items are often lacking a bit in power. This can be further proven by looking at the current state of Inkshadow, where running 5 or 7 is pretty much never worth it, because the strength of the items doesn't justify running so many weak units. Mordog did mention in his rundown that he currently doesn't recommend going deep into the trait, and we can expect some changes to Inkshadow in the future. Considering how the item distribution works, it is more likely that they add more bonus damage and damage reduction instead of pushing the power level of the items, since otherwise you could end up with a situation where 3 Inkshadows becomes a must include for a lot of comps. For now, the 3-piece is still worth playing most of the time, either with the Senna Na reroll or in a Trickshot Kaiser setup, and I don't see this changing anytime soon. What is your favorite Inkshadow item, or which item do you think should be reworked? Let me know in the comments. I hope you learned something, and see you next time.